The phone rang at exactly 2:47 a.m. Charlie Peterson, a man in his mid-50s, sat up abruptly in bed, heart racing. The soft glow of the clock on his nightstand mocked him with its eerie stillness. He wasn't one for late-night disturbances, at least not anymore. Not after all the years of settling into the rhythm of his quiet life. He glanced over at his wife, Linda, still fast asleep beside him, her breathing steady, a soft snore escaping her lips. Charlie exhaled sharply, relieved that the noise hadn't woken her. He had no idea who would be calling at this hour, but instinctively, he knew it was something that would change everything. That kind of feeling, when you just know. "Hello?" He answered the phone, his voice rough with sleep. There was a pause on the other end, then a deep, almost gravelly voice spoke. "Charlie, it's been a long time." He stiffened. That voice. It was familiar but distant, like something buried deep within his past, waiting to resurface at the worst possible moment. "Who is this?" Charlie asked, his mind racing. The words felt hollow in the air, not quite reaching his ears as the weight of recognition set in. The voice sighed, then answered with a hint of amusement. "It's Jake, from your old days. You know, before you became Mr. Perfect Suburban Dad." Charlie's blood ran cold. Jake. Jake Hayes. The name hit him like a sledgehammer. It had been over 20 years since he last heard it. Jake was the wild one. The one who had dragged Charlie into all sorts of trouble back in their 20s. The kind of trouble Charlie had worked hard to forget. The kind of trouble that wasn't just part of youth. It was the kind that left marks, scars, on the soul. "Jake, what the hell? Why are you calling me now?" Charlie asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. His fingers gripped the phone tighter, like it might somehow slip out of his hand and disappear, taking all the uncomfortable memories with it. "Listen," Jake's voice softened, the edge gone. "I need you. It's about something that can't wait, something big, and I know you're going to want in." Charlie's mind swirled. He hadn't talked to Jake since that night, that night. The one where everything went wrong. The one that had set the course for Charlie's life to shift in ways he could barely understand back then. He could hear Linda stirring beside him, sensing his tension even in her sleep. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to drag her into this, whatever this was. But he felt an undeniable pull to the conversation. "You've got 5 minutes, Charlie finally said, knowing that once he allowed this conversation to unfold, there would be no going back. Jake's laugh was low, almost a chuckle. "That's more than enough time, my friend. I just need you to meet me. You owe me that much." Charlie hesitated. "I don't owe you anything. You know that." "Oh, I think you do," Jake responded, his tone darkening. "Remember California? You really think that's all behind you?" Charlie's stomach dropped. The mention of California, of that trip those days, was enough to send a rush of cold sweat over him. Jake had always known how to play him, how to use the past as a tool to manipulate. But this was different. There was something urgent in his voice, something that Charlie couldn't ignore. The silence on the other end stretched out. "Where?" Charlie asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. There was another pause before Jake spoke. "Meet me at the old pier tomorrow night, midnight. Don't bring anyone else, just you and me, and you'll understand." The line went dead before Charlie could say anything more. He stared at the phone, his heartbeat thumping in his chest. Linda stirred again, this time opening her eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked softly, her voice thick with sleep. Charlie swallowed hard, glancing at her. For a moment he considered telling her everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain this? How could he drag her back into that part of his life? No, he couldn't. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a wrong number. Go back to sleep." But as he lay back down, staring at the ceiling, his mind raced. Jake wasn't calling to catch up. He wasn't just reminiscing about old times. This was something else, something bigger, and Charlie could feel it. The kind of feeling that only comes when you've been pulled into a storm, whether you're ready or not. Tomorrow night, at the pier. Charlie didn't know what was waiting for him, but deep down, he knew one thing for sure. This would be the night that would alter the course of everything. Again. Charlie didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, Jake's voice echoed in his head. California. That single word, that single place, seemed to carry the weight of everything that had ever gone wrong in his life. He couldn't shake the feeling that his past had been waiting for him to make one wrong move, and that Jake was the one who had come to collect. By the time dawn cracked through the blinds, Charlie had made up his mind. He would go. He wasn't sure why he was even considering it, but the pull of curiosity and a sense of obligation was too strong. He had to face this, whatever this was. His life in the suburbs, the quiet nights with Linda, the family dinners. It was all too perfect, too normal. Jake was the reminder of everything that had made him feel alive, and everything that had ruined him in the process. He spent the day in a haze. The phone call from Jake seemed to follow him around every corner. Even at work, when he'd normally be consumed with paperwork, meetings, and phone calls, Charlie's mind kept drifting back to that conversation. He couldn't shake the image of the pier, the cold wind, the crashing waves, and the figure of Jake waiting for him there. It felt like something out of a bad dream. Linda noticed the change in him. They were having dinner, a quiet meal as usual, when she glanced at him across the table. "You've been distant all day," she said, her voice soft but knowing. "Everything okay at work?" Charlie picked up his glass of wine, swirling it absent-mindedly. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to tell her the truth either. He couldn't explain what was happening, couldn't explain the call, the pressure he was feeling. He didn't want to drag her into this world he'd left behind. "Yeah, just tired," he replied, his tone flat. "Long day, that's all." Linda didn't press. She had learned over the years to pick her battles, and tonight wasn't the night to push him. But Charlie could see the concern in her eyes, the way she studied him for a second too long before returning to her meal. He hated that look. It was the one that always came when she suspected he was hiding something from her. After dinner, Charlie retreated to his study. He stared at the phone, willing it to ring again, but it stayed silent. There was still time to back out, still time to ignore the past and move on. But he knew that wasn't an option. Jake had always been the kind of person who didn't just walk away. He had a way of pulling you back into the darkness, whether you were ready or not. And Charlie had learned long ago that when Jake called, you answered. As the evening wore on, Charlie found himself pacing. The clock ticked slowly, the hands creeping closer to midnight. He grabbed his jacket, checked his watch again, and sighed. He could hear Linda moving around upstairs, getting ready for bed, completely unaware of what he was about to do. Part of him wanted to tell her, wanted to come clean, but the other part, the part that had lived through so much with Jake, couldn't bring himself to do it. He had buried that part of his life for a reason. He glanced at the clock once more. The time had come. With a final look at the quiet house, Charlie stepped out into the night. The cold air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, but it didn't matter. He wasn't cold. He was numb. His mind raced with memories of things he'd long tried to forget, of the reckless decisions, the late-night drives, the wild moments that felt like they belonged to someone else. He could hear Jake's laugh, the way it echoed in his head like a warning. By the time he reached the pier, the moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. The place looked exactly as it had the last time he'd been here, dark, desolate, and full of ghosts. The creak of old wood beneath his feet sent a shiver down his spine. He hadn't set foot on this pier in over 20 years. Back then, it had been the place of their last adventure, their last risky decision. They'd made promises to each other that night, promises neither of them had kept. Charlie walked to the end of the pier, his eyes scanning the dark waters below. There was no sign of Jake. For a moment, he felt a pang of doubt. Maybe Jake wasn't coming. Maybe he was just trying to get into Charlie's head, play some sick game. But then, from the shadows, he saw him, Jake Hayes. He looked exactly the same. Older, of course, but still the same. Lean, scruffy, with the same mischievous grin that Charlie had always hated and loved at the same time. "Charlie," Jake called, his voice carrying across the empty pier. "I knew you'd show." Charlie didn't answer at first. He just stood there, facing Jake, the years between them stretching like a chasm. The weight of the past settled around them like fog, thick and suffocating. "Let's get this over with," Charlie said finally, his voice more tired than angry. Jake nodded. "You'll understand soon enough." The wind howled through the empty pier, but Charlie barely noticed. Jake's presence was like a heavy weight, dragging him back to a time he'd long buried. The air was thick with the tension between them, like two magnets that had always been too strong to resist, despite all the years apart. Jake leaned against the railing, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the black water met the sky in a seamless blur. He didn't look at Charlie immediately. Instead, he took a long breath as if savoring the moment. "You still don't get it, do you?" Jake's voice cut through the silence. "You never understood why I called you, Charlie. It's not just about the past. It's about now." Charlie clenched his fists at his sides, frustrated. He hadn't come here to be lectured. He hadn't come here to be dragged back into whatever mess Jake had cooked up. But part of him, part of the old Charlie, was listening. He always had been a sucker for Jake's charm, the way Jake made everything sound like an adventure, a challenge. "Why did you call me, Jake?" Charlie's voice was hoarse, as though the words were being pulled out of him. "Why the hell now?" Jake turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in Charlie's expression. There was something about the way Jake looked at him, something calculating that sent a chill down Charlie's spine. It was the same look he'd gotten when they were younger, when they were about to do something reckless, something dangerous. The look that always promised there would be consequences. "You left me," Jake said simply. "And that was fine. I wasn't asking for anything, Charlie. You had your life. I had mine. But you know as well as I do, the things we did back then, they don't just disappear. They don't stay buried. They come back. And when they do, you can either run from it or face it." Charlie swallowed hard. Face it. That word, like a slap to the face, stung. He had spent so many years running from Jake, from their past, from everything that could have and maybe should have changed. The life he'd built with Linda, the job, the house in the suburbs. It had all been his way of pretending none of it ever happened. But deep down, he knew he couldn't outrun Jake forever. No one could. "You want me to face what?" Charlie's voice cracked, but he refused to back down. "I'm not that guy anymore. I'm not the one who's going to get involved in whatever mess you're in." Jake's lips curled into a knowing grin. "You're right. You're not that guy anymore. You've got a wife, a family. You've got responsibilities." He took a step closer to Charlie, his eyes locked onto his. "But that's the point, Charlie. That's why you have to help. You've got too much to lose now. And you know what they say, people with too much to lose are the most dangerous." Charlie took a step back. He hated the way Jake spoke, as though he had some kind of power over him. But the truth was, there was a part of Charlie that still felt that old pull, the part that had stood side by side with Jake, willing to take on the world, no matter the consequences. "What do you need from me, Jake?" Charlie asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He handed it to Charlie without saying a word. Charlie stared at the envelope for a moment, his fingers hovering over it. The paper was crinkled, old. It looked like something that had been sitting in the back of a drawer for years. The air between them grew even heavier as he finally took it from Jake. "Open it," Jake said quietly. Charlie ripped open the envelope, pulling out a single piece of paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words quickly. His breath caught in his throat when he read the first line. It was a letter, not just any letter, a letter from the past, a letter from someone Charlie thought he'd never hear from again. The words on the page were familiar, but the name at the bottom sent a shock through Charlie's chest. He knew that name. It was a name from years ago, a name tied to everything he had left behind when he'd chosen to walk away. It was the name of someone who had once been like family. "Where did you get this?" Charlie's voice was low, his heart pounding in his ears. "How the hell do you have this?" Jake's smile faded slightly, but there was no hint of apology in his expression. "It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is what's inside." He took a step back, letting Charlie read the letter in silence. "You're not getting out of this, Charlie. Not this time." Charlie felt the weight of the letter in his hands, and in that moment, he knew Jake wasn't lying. Whatever this was, it was bigger than anything he had ever imagined, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he was already in deeper than he had ever planned on being. "Let me guess," Charlie said, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. "This is where I'm supposed to say yes, right? To whatever you want me to do." Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to. Charlie knew the answer already. Charlie stood there, holding the letter, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. It was as if the air had thickened, suffocating him with its weight. He could feel the old tug, the pull that had always been there, the one that led him down paths he knew he shouldn't follow. But this time, there was something different about it. There was a new urgency, a fear that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with what was at stake. "You really think I'm just going to drop everything and go along with this?" Charlie's voice was barely a whisper. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but he couldn't help it. The frustration was building inside him, and he hated that Jake seemed to think this was some kind of game. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned back toward the water, letting the wind whip through his jacket, his face set in a grim expression. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when you know the storm is coming, when you're waiting for the inevitable to hit. Charlie took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his mind was racing. The letter in his hands was like a ticking bomb, each second bringing him closer to something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He scanned the page again, hoping that maybe the words would change, that somehow this wasn't real. But it was. The name at the bottom of the letter was unmistakable: Rachel. It had been years since he'd last heard that name, but the memories rushed back in an instant. Rachel had been part of their crew back in the day. She was sharp, tough, and smart as hell, always 3 steps ahead of everyone. And then without warning, she was gone. Charlie never knew why. It was one of those things that never got talked about. But the letter made it clear. Rachel was in trouble. Deep trouble, and the kind of trouble that Charlie couldn't ignore. Jake's voice broke through his thoughts. Rachel's involved now, Charlie. You know her better than anyone. If she's reaching out, it's serious. She's not someone who asks for help, but she needs it. And we both know you can't just walk away. Charlie wanted to say something, wanted to argue, but the truth hit him harder than he expected. Rachel had always been different. She had always been the one who had everything under control, the one who didn't need anyone. But if she was asking for help now, it meant things had gone far beyond what Charlie could understand. He could feel the old sense of loyalty stirring inside him, the same loyalty that had bound them together in the past, the loyalty that had driven them all to make decisions that no one else would understand. "You're not hearing me," Charlie finally said, his voice raw. "This is too much. I've moved on. I've got a life now. I've got responsibilities. Linda, she doesn't even know about this." Jake's eyes softened for a moment, but only for a second. "I get it. You've built a life, Charlie. You've got everything you wanted. But let me ask you this. If it was someone you cared about, if it was Linda or someone else you loved, wouldn't you do whatever it took to protect them? Wouldn't you?" The question hit Charlie like a punch to the gut. He wanted to say no, wanted to tell Jake that he wasn't that guy anymore, that he wasn't the one who would risk it all again. But deep down, he knew the answer. He'd done it before. He'd risked everything to help someone, to protect someone, and he hadn't regretted it then. But this felt different. This felt like stepping back into a world that had almost destroyed him. "I don't know if I can do this," Charlie said, shaking his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. Jake took a step closer, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "You don't have a choice. Not really. You're already in it, whether you like it or not. And you know that. I'm not asking you to be the same guy you were. I'm asking you to be the guy you can be. The one who still has some fight left in him. The one who still knows how to make things right." Charlie felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. Part of him wanted to walk away, to refuse and go back to his comfortable, predictable life. But another part of him, the part that still remembered the adrenaline, the rush, the purpose, was pulling him back toward the chaos. And if there was one thing Charlie knew about himself, it was that he could never resist a fight he knew he had to face. He glanced at the letter again, the name Rachel burning into his mind. It wasn't just about her. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't ignore any longer. With a sigh, he folded the letter slowly and stuffed it back into the envelope. "All right, Jake, what's the plan?" Jake's eyes lit up with a flicker of satisfaction. "You won't regret this, Charlie, I promise." Charlie didn't respond. He didn't know if he would regret it or not. All he knew was that whatever was coming next, he couldn't back out now. It was too late for that. Charlie sat at the worn-out kitchen table, the faded sunlight streaming through the blinds. He couldn't help but think of how things used to be. Back then, everything had been simpler, or at least it had felt that way. There had been a sense of direction, a sense of purpose. Now, sitting in the quiet of his suburban home, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd lost something along the way. Linda had left an hour ago, taking the kids to the park. He didn't tell her what was going on, of course. She wouldn't understand. Hell, he barely understood himself. But something inside him had cracked wide open, and there was no going back. He had made the choice. He'd chosen to step back into a world he thought he'd left behind. The phone rang, snapping Charlie out of his thoughts. He stared at it for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. It was Jake. Of course it was Jake. He'd probably been waiting for Charlie to get cold feet, expecting him to back out at the last minute. But Charlie wasn't backing out. Not now. "Yeah?" he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "We leave in 2 hours. Be ready." Jake's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made it clear this wasn't just another job, this was personal. Charlie nodded, though Jake couldn't see it. Got it. I'll be there. He hung up and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The reality of the situation was finally hitting him. He wasn't just going to help someone this time. He was going to be walking into the heart of something that could tear his life apart. He didn't know the whole story yet, but he knew enough. Rachel had called Jake for a reason. She needed help, and she was in way over her head. The question was, what had gotten so out of hand that she couldn't handle it on her own? He glanced at the clock on the wall. 2 hours. That wasn't a lot of time to get his head around the mess he was about to walk into, but there wasn't time to waste. Charlie stood up, pacing around the small kitchen. He thought about Linda, about the life they'd built. He thought about his kids, his son, Ben, and his daughter, Ellie. He thought about how much he wanted to protect them, how much he wanted to keep them safe from the world he used to know. But he also knew that by stepping away from that world, he'd closed himself off from something that had once meant everything to him. The thrill, the danger, the feeling of being alive in a way that nothing else could replicate. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and pulled it on. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, as though it carried the weight of everything he was about to face. He hadn't been in a fight like this for years, not since the days of Rachel and the rest of the crew. Back then, there was always a plan. There was always a way out. But now, everything felt uncertain. Charlie's eyes landed on the framed photo of his family on the mantel. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't want to do this, but he had to. For Rachel, for the loyalty that still ran deeper than he'd ever let on. The past had a way of creeping up on you when you least expected it, and for Charlie, it was no different. He walked to the door and stopped. One last look around the house, the life he had built. He wasn't sure when he'd become the kind of person who could live in a place like this, but here he was. And for a moment, he almost convinced himself that he could just stay here. He could forget everything. He could leave the past in the past, but he knew it wasn't that simple. His phone buzzed again. It was Jake, texting him this time. "Don't be late. We can't afford any delays." Charlie didn't need the reminder. He was already feeling the pressure mounting, the sense of urgency clawing at him from all sides. He shoved the phone into his pocket and stepped out the door, the cool evening air hitting him like a slap in the face. The car was already waiting, engine running. Jake was behind the wheel, his face hard, unreadable. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He didn't need to. They both knew why they were here. "Ready?" Jake asked, his eyes on the road as he started driving. Charlie didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. It all seemed so far removed from the chaos he was about to step into. "I guess we'll see," he muttered. Jake glanced at him, his expression briefly softening. "It's not too late to back out, you know." Charlie didn't say anything. The option to back out had been there the moment Jake had called him, but now there was no turning back. The car drove into the night, the city lights fading behind them. Whatever was coming next, Charlie knew it was going to change everything. Charlie couldn't remember the last time he'd been this tense. The steady hum of the car's engine was the only sound between him and Jake as they made their way to the outskirts of town. The city lights had long disappeared behind them, swallowed up by the darkness. It felt like they were heading into some unknown, distant place, into something that couldn't be undone, no matter how much they wanted it. "Do you ever think about the good old days?" Jake broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "Before everything got messy?" Charlie glanced at him, catching a flicker of nostalgia in Jake's eyes, a rarity for the man who had always seemed so focused, so composed. But then again, they weren't kids anymore. And they weren't in control of their lives the way they used to be. "Yeah, I think about it sometimes," Charlie replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not the same, is it? We're not the same." Jake gave a short laugh. "You're right, we're not. But we still know how to get things done. That hasn't changed." Charlie nodded, the weight of his old life pressing down on him like a heavy coat. They were getting closer. He could feel it, the thickening air, the tension that hung between them like an invisible thread. The place they were headed wasn't just a job. It was a crossroads, a point of no return. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, with nothing but blackness surrounding them. The familiar roads of home felt like they were hundreds of miles away. The further they went, the more Charlie's gut twisted, the more the reality of what he was about to do set in. "You know," Charlie began, his voice a little louder now, trying to steady himself. I thought I was done with all this. I told myself I'd put it behind me. Jake didn't look over at him, but he didn't need to. You can't outrun your past, Charlie. Trust me, I tried. The words hit harder than expected. They'd both tried, hadn't they? They'd both made their own lives, tried to forget the reckless decisions, the risky choices, the lives they'd lived. But you don't just turn that off. You don't just walk away from who you used to be. The car slowed as they approached a set of tall, industrial buildings looming in the distance. Charlie's stomach tightened. He didn't need to ask if they were close. The scene unfolding before them spoke volumes. Jake took a sharp right turn onto a smaller, unlit road. They passed through a set of gates that didn't belong to any official place, just a forgotten stretch of land filled with rusted equipment and aging warehouses. The landscape had a grim, abandoned feel to it, and Charlie could see why Jake had chosen it. No one would come here. No one would hear what happened. The car stopped in front of a large metal door half hidden in shadow. There were no signs, no markings to indicate what the place was. It could have been a warehouse, a factory, or even an old unused storage space for all Charlie knew. It felt like something from a different life, a life he thought he'd left behind. We're here, Jake said flatly, putting the car in park. Charlie didn't move immediately. He stared out the window, trying to gather himself. This was it. This was where the lines would be drawn, where he would either cross over into something he couldn't walk away from or he would find a way to back out. But there was no turning back now. You sure about this? Jake asked, his voice strangely soft. Charlie looked over at him. For a moment, it felt like they were back in those early days, standing at a crossroads, making decisions that would change everything. Charlie had always trusted Jake, but now, with everything on the line, the weight of that trust felt heavier than ever. I have no choice, Charlie muttered. He couldn't explain it any better than that. It wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about doing the right thing. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't shake. Jake nodded, a brief understanding passing between them. He reached into the back seat and grabbed 2 duffel bags. Let's get this over with. Charlie grabbed his own bag and swung it over his shoulder. He stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting him with a rush. It smelled like metal and dust, like the kind of place where things went down without anyone noticing. The night felt thicker here, darker. Every instinct in Charlie's body screamed at him to turn around, to walk away from whatever was about to happen. But he couldn't. Jake led the way to the metal door. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the stillness. A voice from inside answered, muffled but unmistakable. Get in. Without another word, they pushed the door open and stepped inside. The dim light of old fluorescent bulbs flickered above them, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. It smelled like mildew and oil, a stark contrast to the polished, sterile atmosphere of the life Charlie had built with Linda and the kids. A man stood at the far end of the room, his face partially obscured by shadows. His eyes were cold, assessing. Charlie could feel his presence before he even spoke. Charlie, the man said with a slight nod. You came. Charlie didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made his choice. There was no going back. Charlie took a deep breath, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. The man's cold eyes seemed to pierce through him, as if reading everything he had ever done, everything he was about to do. The air in the room was thick with tension. It felt like a trap. No, worse than that, like they were already trapped. Who's the guy with you? The man asked, his voice dry, almost bored. He wasn't looking at Jake. His eyes were fixed firmly on Charlie, as if Jake didn't matter. This is Jake, Charlie replied, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty he couldn't quite hide. He's with me. The man didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted to Jake, then back to Charlie. I don't like surprises, Charlie. You brought an extra hand, that's fine. Just don't make me regret it. Jake stood next to Charlie without flinching, his arms crossed. There was something about Jake's presence that made it clear he wasn't scared. He was calculating. And that was worse. Because while Charlie was stuck in his own internal battle, Jake was already thinking 10 moves ahead. Let's get this over with, Jake said, his voice sharp, as if he had no time for any of this. Charlie didn't look at him. He couldn't. Jake wasn't a kid anymore. Neither was he. But that didn't change the fact that they were standing in the middle of a nightmare they couldn't just walk out of. The man gestured to a metal table in the corner, where a large stack of documents and a few scattered items lay. There was nothing particularly interesting about the setup, but Charlie felt the weight of it all, the expectations, the promises made, The consequences if things went wrong. "You know why you're here, right?" the man continued, his voice laced with impatience. "This isn't a favor, Charlie. You owe me, and you always knew you would." Charlie nodded, but his throat tightened. He could feel the heat of the moment creeping up on him. Was this it? Was this really happening? He told himself over and over that he could walk away from this life, that he wasn't the same person he'd been all those years ago. But here he was, staring at the cold metal table, listening to a man he'd once tried to outrun. "I remember," Charlie finally said, his voice low, barely audible. "Good," the man replied. "Then let's move forward." Charlie's stomach churned. He had no idea what was on those documents, but he knew whatever it was, it would change everything. It always did. Without a word, the man walked over to the table, flipping through the stack. He pulled out a single sheet and handed it to Charlie. "This is the deal," he said. "Sign it, and everything you've been looking for will be yours. The money, the clean slate, the whole thing." Charlie stared at the document, feeling his pulse quicken. The terms weren't clear yet, but he didn't need to read the fine print. He knew how these deals went. He knew the price. He felt Jake's eyes on him, waiting, expecting him to make the next move. Charlie's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the paper. He didn't know what was worse, what was in the deal, or the thought that signing it would mean he had truly crossed the line. There would be no going back. He'd burn every bridge that had ever existed behind him. He glanced up at the man. "What happens if I don't sign?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's lips curled into a slow smile. "Let's just say, you don't want to find out." Charlie's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. He knew what that smile meant. It was the kind of smile that said everything without having to say a word. Jake shifted slightly, but it was clear he was waiting. Charlie had to make a choice. The room was silent. Everything felt still, as if the world was holding its breath. Charlie's gaze moved between the paper and the man, his mind racing. What was his out? Could there even be an out? "You've already come this far, Charlie," the man continued, his tone almost soothing now. "What's one more step?" Charlie didn't want to admit it, but the words hit harder than he wanted. They were true. He was already in this. He always had been, deep down. There was no escaping the past, no running from the choices he'd made. And yet, he still hesitated. Was it fear, or was it something else? Finally, Charlie exhaled, his breath shaky. He glanced over at Jake. "What do you think?" Jake's face was unreadable. After a long moment, he simply said, "It's up to you. I'm not here to make decisions for you." Charlie's hand moved toward the pen. It hovered above the paper for a second longer than it should have, but in the end, he did what he always did. He signed. The man smiled again. "Good choice, Charlie." Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that he had just signed his soul away, but there was no turning back now. The deal had been made, and whatever came next, they would all have to live with it. Charlie sat back, the ink from the pen still fresh on the page, his mind racing in circles. The room felt colder now, the weight of his decision hanging in the air like a thick fog. He could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the faint sounds of the city continuing as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Jake's face was unreadable, the same calm composure that had been there since they walked in. But Charlie knew him too well. There was something different now, a subtle shift, like the air before a storm. Jake had always been the pragmatic one, the kind of guy who did what needed to be done, no matter the cost. But in this moment, Charlie couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Jake than he had ever let on. The man at the table was already slipping the documents back into their folder, his hands smooth and deliberate. "I'll arrange everything," he said. "You'll be hearing from my people. But know this, there's no going back now. The path you've chosen doesn't leave room for regrets." Charlie nodded. His throat felt dry, his stomach twisted in knots. Regrets had always been a part of the deal, but this felt different. The finality of it all. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that felt like an omen. Charlie stood up slowly, the weight of his own legs seeming unfamiliar, as though he were stepping into someone else's life. He turned to Jake, who was still leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "Ready?" Charlie asked, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Jake or himself. Jake's eyes locked with his. There was a quiet intensity there, but no judgment, no criticism, just understanding. "Always," he replied. The words simple but heavy with meaning. Charlie walked towards the door, the echo of his footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet room. The man didn't say anything more, but Charlie could feel the finality in the air. He didn't need to hear any more promises. The deal had been made. And now, it was time to face whatever came next. As he opened the door, a sharp cold wind rushed in from the hallway, biting against his skin. He stepped out, followed closely by Jake. For a brief moment, Charlie looked back at the door, at the shadowy figure still sitting in the room behind it, like the ghost of a past he couldn't escape. He didn't know what he had just agreed to, but something gnawed at him, a feeling in his gut that he couldn't quite shake off. Was it a mistake? Could he have walked away? Jake stopped beside him, leaning in just slightly, his voice barely a whisper. "You know, Charlie, there's one thing they don't tell you about deals like these." Charlie turned to face him, eyebrows raised. "What's that?" Jake's lips curved into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "They always come with a catch, but it's not what you think. The real catch is that you never really know who's been playing who." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. He stared at Jake, searching for a sign that this was some kind of joke, but the expression on Jake's face was as serious as ever. "Wait, what are you talking about?" Charlie asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Jake gave him a look that Charlie couldn't quite read, his eyes narrowing, just a flicker of something passing through them. "You thought you were in control, didn't you?" Charlie's mind raced, but before he could respond, Jake stepped away, moving toward the elevator. "Trust me, you'll find out soon enough. Everyone does." Charlie stood there for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. Had Jake known all along? Had he been playing his own game within this game? The thought was enough to make Charlie's stomach churn. He moved quickly to catch up, but as he reached the elevator, a sharp buzz sounded through the building. The elevator door didn't open immediately, and for a brief moment the only sound was the thrum of Charlie's pulse in his ears. Then, the door finally slid open, but instead of the usual sterile glow of the lobby, there was something different. A shadow in the corner of the elevator, a figure standing just out of sight. Charlie's breath hitched. It was as though time had stopped for a second. The figure turned, revealing the faintest outline of someone Charlie knew all too well, someone from his past. "No," Charlie whispered, stepping backward. "It can't be." But before he could say another word, the figure stepped forward, the door of the elevator closing behind them both, and the world seemed to shift entirely. The woman's smile was all too familiar, and it made Charlie's heart race faster than it ever had before. "Hello, Charlie," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that shook him to his core. It was her. It was Alice. And in that moment, Charlie understood. The catch had never been about the deal. It had been about this. It had always been about this moment, this revelation. Everything he had believed, the choices, the steps, the moves, had been manipulated by the one person he had never expected to see again. Alice, the one who knew him better than anyone else, the one who had always been 3 steps ahead. And now, as they stood together in the elevator, Charlie realized that the true cost of the deal was far more than anything he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't about a clean slate. This was about her, and everything he thought he knew was about to be rewritten. As the elevator doors slid closed, Charlie's world faded into darkness, and the only thing he could hear was the soft sound of Alice's laugh echoing through the silence.